At 6:02 a.m., northeastern Ukraine narrowly avoided another catastrophe, the kind that often forces governments to convene emergency meetings and analysts to appear on late-night television. A Russian Mi-8 transport helicopter took off from a frontline base with a full assault squad on board. By Russian standards, this was theoretically predictable and, ironically, precisely the kind of routine operation that leads to casualties. The pilots flew low, hugging the terrain and following the contours of local roads. In theory, it was a clever way to avoid radar. In reality, they were heading straight into something far cruder, far cheaper, and far harder to fool than any radar system they had been trained to use. So, the question hanging over that fog-shrouded scene is simple. What really happened there? And how close did both sides get to triggering a chain of events neither side wanted? If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like it and let me know where you were watching from in the comments below. To understand what happened, we need to step back and consider the strategic chessboard. Northeast Ukraine is not just fields and trees, it's a logistical funnel. Any helicopter attack moving through that area is aimed at shaping the terrain, consolidating weak points, redeploying attacking forces, or probing Ukrainian defenses. For Ukraine, letting the Mi-8 through would mean giving Russia a tactical advantage within striking distance of frontline positions. That's why the Ukrainians aren't investing in expensive Western radars or high-end satellites, but rather in something that at first glance seems incredibly outdated: an acoustic detection network built from modified smartphones, tiny microphones, dummy rocks, trash cans, and solar-powered rechargeable batteries. If that sounds too simple to work, keep listening, because this system will soon do what modern air defense radars can't. At 4 a.m., 3 Ukrainian FPV drone operators were in position, nestled in the damp, cold fog. They weren't waiting for daylight, nor were they waiting for orders. They were waiting for a sound. Their drones were homemade weapons, racing airframes with Soviet-era RPG warheads strapped to carbon fiber arms with drawstrings. It wasn't exactly the kind of technology you'd see in a Pentagon procurement brochure, but it was effective in ways the Russians underestimated. Each operator was assigned a route: the MO3 highway, the northern farm roads, and the southern river valley. If the Mi-8 followed any of those 3 routes, at least one operator would have the chance to execute the first FPV helicopter interception in military history. The key to this entire operation was the acoustic network. It worked like Shazam for helicopters, identifying the aircraft not by radar signals or visual silhouettes, but by the low-frequency beat of the rotor blades. When the first sensor picked up a peak in the 35 Hz range, the acoustic fingerprint of the Mi-8's twin turbocharger engines, the system began locating it immediately. Sound travels at a speed of 343 meters per second. By tracking small differences in arrival times between sensors, the system can locate a helicopter within 50 meters at a range of 5 kilometers. No radar, no infrared, no digital optics, just physics and patience. Just seconds later, 2 more sensors signaled simultaneously. The positioning process was complete. The Mi-8 was flying over the MO3 highway at 150 km/h at an altitude of 40 meters. Flying so low sounded clever until you remembered a basic principle: the lower you fly, the louder the sound. The morning temperature inversion acted like an atmospheric loudspeaker, bending the noise of the rotor blades toward the ground. The Russian pilots, unknowingly, were broadcasting their presence like a marching band in an empty stadium. The Ukrainian operator in charge of MO3 immediately launched his reconnaissance drone. The northern operator checked his feed, still nothing. The southern operator began calculating the intercept geometry. Even with a drone with a top speed of around 100 km/h, theoretically, interception would still be possible if they could predict the Mi-8's location, not its current position. This isn't Hollywood, no chases, just preparation, but battlefield engineering has its humor. The main operator discovered that his flagship Shrike-10 drone, a bizarre hybrid of Chinese racing electronics and a PG-7M warhead, had a corroded detonator. Months of dampness had damaged the piezoelectric detonator crystal. In any other military, that would mean aborting the mission. In Ukraine, it meant kneeling on the wet grass, cursing under your breath, and beginning to fix the problem with wire, tape, and prayer. Meanwhile, the acoustic network updated. Direction 285 degrees, steady speed, steady altitude. But then something unexpected happened. The helicopter left the highway and turned onto a small dirt road. That deviation was not in any predictable trajectory. Perhaps the pilot saw something, perhaps he heard something, or perhaps he simply trusted a false instinct. Either way, he had just stepped out of the safe zone and into the dangerous. Fog rolled in from the river, thickening into a dense wall less than 60 meters thick. Within minutes, visual sensors would be blind. Radar was useless at this altitude. Only sound remained, and although sound could pinpoint the helicopter's location, it couldn't provide the precise 3D positioning needed for a perfect interception. Time was running out for the Ukrainians. Then another hurdle arose. The northern operator's control battery died in the cold. He replaced it with a spare wrapped in a hand warmer, a battlefield trick any engineer would cringe at. His second drone wasn't ideal, shorter range, weaker transmitter, but it still worked. And on this battlefield, working was always better than perfect. The southern operator launched first and immediately lost sight of it. His camera turned into a gray noise storm as the drone entered the fog. With no visual signal, no instrumentation, and no horizon reference point, he was flying solely on compass direction and mental calculations. The acoustic team provided updates, changes in direction, Doppler signals, speed estimates, essentially guiding a drone blindly toward a moving target based entirely on geometry. Physics doesn't lie, and the constraints were clear. The helicopter couldn't fly high without entering radar coverage, couldn't leave the road without risking a collision with power lines, and couldn't accelerate without burning through the fuel reserves needed for a return trip. The operator didn't need to see the helicopter, they just needed to anticipate it. At this point, the main operator, after making temporary repairs to his armed drone, launched the backup drone into the fog. His battery was at 75% and draining rapidly. The cold air increased the internal resistance of the LiPo battery, meaning the energy would be depleted faster during operation. Meanwhile, a Russian Borisogledsk-2 electronic warfare system detected the drone launch and immediately began scanning the frequency spectrum. Unfortunately for them, the Ukrainians were using Express LRS, an open-source control protocol that hopped frequencies hundreds of times per second. Interfering with it was like trying to swat a fly capable of instantaneous movement. Then, at 0621, as predicted, the Mi-8 emerged from the fog precisely where the calculations indicated. Still on the dirt road, still at 150 km/h, still behaving as if nothing unusual had happened. And now, the real chase, or rather, the real interception, was about to begin. When the Mi-8 emerged from the fog at 0621, it gave the Ukrainians a brief moment to observe before returning to almost completely obscured terrain. The reconnaissance drone spotted the first silhouette, a long fuselage, wind blowing down and stirring up frost, rotor discs gleaming due to temperature inversion. For most armies, that image would be the start of a firefight. For the Ukrainians, it was the midpoint. The real work had been done long before this moment: positioning, calculations, triangulation, and accepting that there was no second chance. The lead operator looked at his battery. 60%, 3 kilometers to fly. That calculation was not pleasant. His drone had a maximum speed of about 100 km/h. The helicopter flew at 150 km/h. Pursuit was impossible, but pursuit wasn't the goal. This was an interception problem, more geometric than aerial combat. If he could get ahead of the helicopter, he wouldn't need speed. He needed time, position, and a bit of luck. He piloted the drone forward through dense jamming. Analog video at 5.8 GHz wasn't pretty, but it was incredibly fast. A 20-millisecond delay was far superior to the 100-millisecond delay of digital. When you deliberately ram an aircraft at 150 km/h with homemade guided munitions, every millisecond is a gift. Meanwhile, the two remaining Ukrainian pilots fanned out, hovering at waiting points along the way. Each drone was now part of a multi-layered ambush: primary gunner, secondary gunner, and surveillance recorder. Redundancy wasn't a luxury, it was survival. If the first drone failed, the second was already in position. If that aircraft malfunctions, a third aircraft will record and correct it. In this type of warfare, the winner isn't the one with the best equipment. It's the one with the fewest single failures. The Russian electronic warfare crew, parked miles away, still couldn't lock onto a stable control frequency. Their spectrum analyzers displayed ghost signals, flickering bursts of energy jumping from one band to another. They weren't pursuing a radio link, they were pursuing a probability. Express LRS switched channels faster than the rerouting speed of the Russian electronic warfare EW systems. The crew knew something was happening, but they couldn't isolate it well enough to do anything useful. This was equivalent to the military hearing footsteps in the dark but having no flashlight. At this point, the only factor the Ukrainians could rely on was physics. The audio network reported, "Target 300 seconds from target, steady flight path, constant speed, constant altitude." The Mi-8 was not maneuvering. It wasn't climbing or diving. It flew like a machine locked into doctrine, fast, low, predictable. Predictability is survival in some environments, but in this case, it was a near-suicidal burden. Then the fog thickened again. The chief operator reached the intercept point with 40% battery remaining, hovering 5 meters above the field beside the dirt road. He reduced engine power to conserve energy. Each percentage point now corresponded to 7 seconds of flight time, 7 seconds of chance, or 7 seconds of watching history slip away. The display flickered violently, the fog distorting the analog signal until it looked like combat footage recovered from a corrupted archive. Other operators reported, "Support ready. Observing position. Waiting for target signal." Then the sound crew, the unsung heroes really, made the announcement everyone had been waiting for. 30 seconds to go. Triangulation within 50 meters. That was remarkable accuracy for a battery-operated system smaller than a candy bar, hidden among trash cans and fake rocks. But that was exactly why it mattered. Radar was ineffective at low altitudes. Infrared light was scattered in fog. Optical systems saw nothing in low visibility. But sound? Sound spoke volumes. And the beat of the Mi-8's 5-bladed rotor, steady at 192 RPM, was as clear as a fingerprint. With 10 seconds to go, sunlight penetrated the fog long enough to reflect off the helicopter's canopy. That moment confirmed everything. Heading, altitude, speed. The Mi-8 was about to fly directly over the commander's position. What the Russian pilot didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Soviet doctrine had never prepared him to fear anything coming from below. His threat model was frozen in the 20th century. At 6:24, the Mi-8 roared overhead. The operator didn't hesitate. He pushed the throttles forward. All 4 engines revved up, pulling maximum power. The drone soared into the rotor vortex, a violent, chaotic turbulence that was completely different from any training simulation. The drone spun on 3 axes in an instant. The operator tried to keep his balance with the half-choked image, guessing direction from the way the static distorted on the screen. Pilots sometimes spoke of flying by feel. The FPV operator flies with noise, video noise, signal noise, and the noise of instinct honed over thousands of simulated crashes. Approach speed, extremely slow. The helicopter pulls away even as the drone climbs, but the operator is trained for this precise geometry. You don't chase. You let the helicopter get out of reach. Then you cut the corner. The second operator watches the entire scene through the camera of his drone, hovering in the distance. He's prepared to accelerate and attack if the first drone misses, but he doesn't launch early. This isn't desperation. This is discipline. One drone at a time. One chance at a time. The third operator, watching from afar, continues to record. The recording is important tactically, politically, historically. The military denied what it couldn't see. Remote surveillance made denial impossible. The Russian pilot still hadn't reacted. To be fair, there was nothing to react to. Below him, the FPV drone was practically invisible on the ground. No radar, no infrared beam, no electronic signal strong enough to register. To the Mi-8 crew, the sky was clear, but the operator had seen it all. The battery was at 30%. The countdown was accelerating. 9 minutes of cold air flight had been reduced to 4. The operator pressed every button he had. The drone stabilized for a moment, long enough to align its interception path. To the naked eye, this looked like nothing, just a tiny dot rising into the sky. To the operator, it was a moment measured by physics and probability. This wasn't a movie. It wasn't flashy. It was just math meets guts. At 6:25, the drone made contact. The warhead exploded instantly, and the laws of physics, ancient, harsh, and non-negotiable, came into play. When the PG-7 warhead exploded against the Mi-8 at 6:25, the result was not dramatic. It was inevitable. Shaped warheads have no emotion. They don't care about armor, pilot skill, or doctrine. They care only about physics. And the physics behind the Monroe effect is as ancient as it is cruel. A copper-lined chamber collapses inward, creating a jet of molten metal traveling at nearly 8,000 meters per second, faster than orbital speed. That jet of metal can penetrate 300 mm of rolled steel armor, the Mi-8's aluminum skin, just 2 km. This was clearly not an equal encounter. The helicopter didn't explode in the Hollywood style. It suffered a catastrophic, immediate structural failure. Flames roared through the fuselage as the aircraft lost lift and plummeted fatefully to the ground, crashing in a column of fire and its propellers shattered. From a surveillance drone, the scene looked cold, precise, geometric, almost impersonal. A target identified, a target attacked, a target destroyed. But what mattered was not the explosion. What mattered was the significance. A $500 homemade drone, flown by 3 people in fog so thick it obscured the horizon, had just defeated a multi-million-dollar aircraft backed by one of the world's most advanced electronic warfare systems. It should not have happened. Even military planners at Western military colleges routinely dismiss drone versus helicopter engagements as theoretically possible but operationally impossible. But war has a way of rewarding the impossible, especially when that improbability is cheap, silent, and mathematically plausible. The Russian Borisogledsk II electronic warfare crew finally knew something was terribly wrong when the Mi-8's emergency beacon activated. That beacon, ironically designed to aid rescuers, also confirmed to anyone listening that the helicopter was no longer airborne. By the time they processed the signal, the Ukrainian drones were gone, their operators packing up their equipment and preparing for the inevitable artillery response. Because in this war, victory isn't about explosions. Victory is about getting out before someone locates you and tries to retaliate. So what made this engagement so important? Let's break down the tactical implications. The acoustic network doesn't depend on line of sight or weather conditions. Fog, darkness, low-altitude obscurity, none of it matters. The sound of helicopter blades is a signature you can't hide, and by calculating the difference between sensors, Ukraine has essentially built a cheap, passive radar system. When you can locate an aircraft without emitting any signal of your own, you're no longer playing defense, you're playing chess. A single FPV drone is nothing special. A fleet of FPVs connected to a guerrilla-run acoustic network, running on open-source frequency hopping protocols, controlled by people who see math as a weapon. That's a system. And systems win wars. The United States has long preached the principle of network-centric warfare. What Ukraine has demonstrated here is that networks don't have to be expensive, they just have to be smarter. Military, what the Ukrainians did, for decades, helicopter pilots have been trained to fear missiles, radar, manpads, and anti-aircraft fire. Not kamikaze robots that zoom in from below at 100 km/h. Russia has struggled to accept the harsh reality. The skies are no longer the exclusive domain of aircraft. Ground forces now have equal and sometimes superior range. And when aircraft fly low to avoid radar, they fly straight into FPV range. It's a trap of their own making. Russian EW systems are very effective against older drones that rely on single-frequency control. But frequency-hopping protocols like Express LRS change the game completely. EW operators are left staring at a noisy screen, knowing the threat exists, but unable to isolate it long enough to destroy it. It's not a failure of technology. It's a failure of doctrine. There's a reason why that matters. Because once something's been done once, it can be done again, and again, and again. Militaries adapt not to hypotheses, but to precedents. This engagement is now a precedent. Ukrainian operators don't celebrate. They don't have time. They pack up their equipment, disable their control units, and move to secondary positions. Russian artillery usually responds quickly when something embarrassing happens. But make no mistake, what they achieved had far-reaching implications beyond that obscure battlefield. For Russia, the engagement demonstrated a new vulnerability. Low-flying helicopters that avoided radar now faced threats from the ground that were cheaper, faster, and harder to detect than anything their operational doctrine had prepared them for. Every Mi-8, Mi-24, K-52, and transport now operated under a new shadow, the threat of an FPV, remotely piloted aircraft ambush. For Ukraine, it was proof that the idea worked. Acoustic networking worked. Distributed sensors worked. Semi-autonomous FPV teams worked, and improvisation of the kind Western militaries often dismiss as undisciplined proved not just possible, but indispensable. For Western analysts, the lesson is simple. The battlefields of the future will not be dominated by the side with the better planes, but by the side with the better networks. The political implications beyond. This conflict will not be remembered for who won or lost. It will be remembered for updating the global strategic playbook. It demonstrated that a beleaguered nation with limited resources and overwhelming odds can create asymmetric advantages that change the landscape. It also reinforced a sobering truth. The line between safety and vulnerability in modern warfare is thinner than ever. A low-flying helicopter pilot may feel safe, but that confidence ends the moment a homemade drone pierces the fog with a warhead. As the smoke cleared and the last remnants of the explosion faded into the morning mist, the Ukrainian soldiers quietly left. No speeches, no boasting, just a quiet understanding that today they had rewritten a chapter of modern warfare. And as always, we end with the most important question of all. What do you think would have happened if that submarine had remained hidden for another 30 minutes? Leave a comment and let me know. Thanks, and see you in the next video.